So one of our big goals with Legion is to get more people into theory crafting. And part of making that happen is exposing you to the actual theory crafting while it's going on. We want you to learn by example. So I had our very own theory crafter and designer, Swole, walk me through his process for Elemental Shaman. So you'll see that we compare his first real attempt at making a good elemental rotation with Binkenstein's rotation, which is also currently in development. And remember, these are both starting points, and there's a lot yet to be figured out, which is why I think this is the best time to expose you to these rotations so that you can also jump in and help in the collaboration process. Now, this is a two-part series. The first part looks at a SimC rotation and how you can enter that into Mr. Robot Simulator. And the second part compares the two rotations, and we figure out what is best about each one, and then we combine the ideas. So let's get started. I'll let Swole take it from here.
Okay, so I made a default rotation for Elemental Shamans yesterday. We have template rotations in the beta just as placeholders to make sure that all of the abilities are being used so people can debug. Template rotations are not meant to be good. They're, they're pretty bad for a lot of specs. So for Elemental, I made a real rotation. And then today, another theory crafter, Binkenstein, posted one of his rotations for us to compare to. He writes his rotations for SimC. So I'm going to show you first a little bit on how to put SimC rotations into our simulator. And by how to do it, I mean some of the conditions work a little different. So I'm going to show a few of the differences, and we'll get his rotation into our simulator, and then we'll compare the rotations, and we'll do a little bit of how you merge two rotations to make a better one. All right, so here's his rotation. He has two action lists, one called AoE and one called single for AoE and single target. He picks which action list to call based on that. So we'll do the single target one first. First we should check, does he have pre-fight? He does. He has a couple of pre-fight things. He uses Stormkeeper and Totem Mastery before the fight starts. So I made a pre-fight rotation, and I do Totem Mastery and Stormkeeper before the fight starts. One difference in our simulator is persistent buffs on the player need to be included somewhere in your rotation. The pre-fight rotation is a good place to do it. These are just persistent buffs. Some of them require artifact traits. You apply them in the pre-fight rotation. And then you set the start time to time up how you want. We want Stormkeeper to be cast at time 0. Totem Mastery has a 1 second global cooldown, so we can do it at -1. Now, if you don't have Totem Mastery, then you probably want to start this at time 0. So you could say you could start it at time 0 if you don't have Totem Mastery. Because none of these other things have a cast time. They're just buffs. Alright, so now we go to the rotation. And we're not going to go through this line by line, because some of them are fairly simple, and they look almost the same in the two. So this line, for instance, cast Totem Mastery if you have Totem Mastery talent and the Resonance Totem buff time remaining is less than 2. You pretty much do that the same in both simulators. Say Totem Mastery if buff remaining second. Tailwind Totem less. I picked Tailwind Totem instead of Resonance. It doesn't matter for that talent. You can pick any of the 4 totems that it puts down.
And now I see that you didn't check for the the
Right,
buff.
right. The talent abilities that require talents, that requirement is directly on the spell itself.
Okay,
So
so the simulator handles it
the
for
simulator
you.
handles it. So if we were to go and look at the spell Totem Mastery, all right, it's right there. Required talent, Totem Mastery. So it can't cast this spell unless you have Totem Mastery. Conditions like that are baked in to our simulator, so you don't need to put them in the rotation.
Okay.
You can't cast a spell if you don't have the talent to cast the spell. Um, and then, yeah, he casts Fire Elemental and then Storm Elemental, and then we get to Ascendance. This one has a little more of a condition. So he says if dot dot flame shock dot remains greater than buff dot ascendance dot duration. So he's saying cast ascendance if the remaining time on your flame shock dot is greater than the duration of ascendance. And either bloodlust is up or the time in the fight is greater than or equal to 60. So basically he's saying either you have bloodlust or bloodlust is over. And the assumption here is that bloodlust is cast at the start of the fight. SimC automatically casts bloodlust at the start of the fight. It's kind of a global option for the simulation. In our simulator, you need to put it in the rotation. You don't actually cast it, so it doesn't cause a global cooldown or anything like that, but you need to put it in the rotation. So I always put bloodlust at the top as the first thing that happens when the fight starts. And then he has another condition, and the cooldown remaining on Lava Burst is greater than 0. So he's saying, don't use Ascendance when I can already use Lava Burst. That's because when you pop Ascendance, it removes the cooldown on Lava Burst, so it effectively cools it down for you, so you can get a little tiny boost by casting a Lava Burst again sooner than you regularly could have. And not you don't have the Stormkeeper buff. All right. So how do we do that in our simulator? It looks pretty much the same. Dot remaining on Flame Shock greater than the buff duration second of Ascendance, and you have Bloodlust or fight remaining less than the fight duration minus 60. It's just another way of saying fight time greater than 60 because we don't have a function that tells you how much time has elapsed in the fight. We have a function that tells you how much time is remaining in the fight. And the cooldown on Lava Burst is greater than 0, and you don't have Stormkeeper. So even though at first glance these look different, they're really working very similarly. Okay, then he casts Elemental Mastery, and then he casts Flame Shock if you have met these certain conditions. And what he's doing here is Ascendance is a long cooldown. It has a cooldown of 3 minutes, and it's a 15-second buff that lets you just spam Lava Burst, which normally has a long cooldown. It's one of your strongest spells. It always crits if the Flame Shock dot is on the target. So this condition here is saying, basically, if I'm going to be casting Ascendance soon, I want to make sure that Flame Shock is going to last for the entire duration of Ascendance, because I don't want to waste a global cooldown during Ascendance refreshing Flame Shock. I just want to spam Lava Burst. And so when you look at this in the SimC rotation, um, he says, put it up if you don't have Flame Shock, or the time the when you say remains, this implicitly says the remaining time on the flame shock dot. If it's less than the duration of ascendance and the cooldown of ascendance plus the duration of ascendance is less than the duration of flame shock. So this is where you're going to see a difference between our simulator and SimC. This duration here, flame shock has a variable duration. It's 15 seconds and it can be increased up to 100% based on how much maelstrom you use when you cast it. So this condition here says only cast it if your maelstrom is greater than or equal to 20. So the duration is always going to be 30 seconds when you cast it. So I'm not entirely sure how SimC knows that this duration is supposed to equal 30. Because in our simulator, if you just said dot duration, it's going to look at the formula for the duration of the dot. And the formula for the duration of the dot is 15 times 1 plus alternate power spent divided by 20. So the duration is dependent on how much maelstrom you spend. So if you were to check that in a rotation, it wouldn't know how much alternate power you're going to spend, and it wouldn't know that you're trying to use 30 seconds as your duration. So in our simulator, you need to explicitly say the buff rate is less than 30. You need to tell it the number because we don't know how to figure out what duration you want. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little complicated. But basically, flame shock is special because it has a variable duration. Alright, so then he casts Earth Shock if your alternate power is greater than or equal to 92. The number 92 is significant because a lightning bolt gives you back 8 maelstrom. So you want to use Earth Shock to dump all your maelstrom so you don't waste any of the maelstrom that you generate. Alright, then he casts Lava Burst. This one actually had a slight difference. If dot dot flame shock dot remains greater than cast time and cooldown react. I'm not going to explain cooldown react right now. That's a special thing in SimC. You don't need it in our simulator. Our simulator does this automatically. So he's saying cast Lava Burst if the duration of the flame shot dot is greater than the cast time of Lava Burst. Because you'll always get a crit if you have the dot, and the game calculates whether or not you crit at the end of the cast time, not when the projectile hits. So whenever you see cooldown react in the SimC rotation, you can ignore it for the AskMrRobot rotation. We do it automatically. And if somebody wants a more in-depth explanation on that, we have a whole article written up on it that we'll post sometime soon. Alright, so then he has another line for Flame Shock, which is less restrictive, that basically says refresh Flame Shock if I can. So if my maelstrom is greater than or equal to 20, and all dots use the pandemic, so as long as the duration remaining is less than 30% of the duration of Flame Shock, you can refresh it and it'll just add the length. We have a function built in for that called can refresh dot, so you don't need to do dot dot flame shock dot duration times, or the remaining time less than or equal to the duration times 0.3. You don't need to do that in ours. You can just say can refresh dot flame shock. It does the exact same thing. Just we added in as a shorthand. Okay. And then he has some conditions for frost shock that depend on movement. He's saying that you should cast frost shock if you have greater than or equal to 20 maelstrom, you have ice fury, and you're gonna start moving in. See, raid event dot movement in greater than 1.5 times spell haste times buff dot ice fury dot stack. Not entirely sure what he's trying to do here. He's saying cast frost shock if you have 20 maelstrom, you have ice fury, and you're not gonna move. Okay, so he wants to use frost shock while moving if you're gonna start moving before you would lose your ice fury stacks. It's more efficient to use it as a movement spell if you're gonna move. So that makes sense. That's more optimized. We're going to be adding movement into our simulator soon. For now, I just said cast Frost Shock if you have Ice Fury and your alternate power greater than or equal to 20. And then he has another Earth Shock line here. It says if your alternate power greater than or equal to 86. That's significant because you don't want to cap out by casting Lava Burst. And then cast Lightning Bolt if you have Stormkeeper and Power of the Maelstrom. Then Elemental Blast. Then Ice Fury. And then Liquid Magma Totem. It's not a very good single target talent, but it's still worth using. It'll increase your damage. So his condition, he says, if you have the talent and ads are going to show up. If you're going to be able to do AoE before the totem cools down, you don't want to use it because this is way better for AoE. So that's what his condition is doing. He's saying use it, but only if it won't be on cooldown when you're going to do AoE. We have a built-in condition for that. We could say you can flag it as a cooldown. You can say save it for AoE, and then tell it how many enemies and what radius. And it'll automatically do the logic that's in the SimC rotation. It'll use it unless using it would mean that it's stuck on cooldown when the AoE starts. So it'll do that automatically. It'll save for the AoE. All right, then use Stormkeeper. You really don't want Stormkeeper while you're in Ascendance. So you only want to use it if the cooldown on Ascendance is greater. He has greater than 10 seconds, so that you can use up your Stormkeeper buffs before you use Ascendance. And then refresh your Tailwind Totem. This logic here that he has is making sure that you won't lose your Totem Mastery during Ascendance. It's the same idea as the condition on Flame Shock up here. And then he actually doesn't have this line. I added it in. If you have this legendary item, it's worth using Earthquake Totem against single target. Whether or not that's the exact right place for it, I'm not 100% sure. And then Chain Lightning. So if there's two targets it's better to use chain lightning. If there's one target, use lightning bolt. An AoE rotation is super simple. Liquid magma, earthquake when you can, chain lightning. You'll see in his AoE rotation, earthquake totem if maelstrom greater than or equal to 50. I don't think you need 50 maelstrom to use earthquake totem. In SimC, you actually don't need this if maelstrom greater than or equal to 50. It won't cast it unless you have 50 maelstrom. So he can actually take that out of his rotation and it'll do the exact same thing. Now the other thing that he has is this cycle targets if debuff.lightningrod.up. He has it on lightning bolt and chain lightning. They'll put a lightning rod on their main target, and then lightning bolt and chain lightning will do damage to all lightning rods. So when you're fighting more than one target, if you get a lightning rod proc on your current target, you want to tab to a different target so that you can try to get another lightning rod buff going, debuff going at the same time, because then your damage will hit, the lightning rod damage will hit two targets. So every time you get a proc, you want to switch targets to one that doesn't have a lightning rod. Now we don't have anything like that in our rotation. We don't have this cycle targets equal 1. We do it a different way. We have what's called a target priority. And you can have conditions. So the boss script itself has a target priority that you will follow. These target priority filters can override that. So I said, if there's more than one target, and you have the talent lightning rod, you want to look for a target that doesn't have the lightning rod buff. So the way that the simulator works is first it picks a target, then it checks the rotation. So when you have more than one target up, it's gonna check, it's gonna say, all right, does this target have lightning rod? And do I have the lightning rod talent? If no, if I don't have lightning rod, it'll pick that target. If it does have lightning rod, it's gonna go to the next target in the priority in the boss script, and it's gonna do this check again. It's gonna say, does it have lightning rod? No. Okay, I can use this target, and then it'll pick the action to do. So that accomplishes cycle targets. You just have to have the condition under which you want to start cycling targets. All right, so this is, and then, oh yeah, the one more thing, I added this little cooldowns action list because SimC automatically uses, I think it automatically uses trinkets. Actually, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't use trinkets and racial actives. I'm not sure. Either way, these would be in the rotation somewhere. I just put them at the top. Just use them when they're ready. There's probably some optimization that could be done around those, just depending on their cooldowns. It's one of those things that are really variable. This is something we could take a look at for future improvements. Because this rotation is not a completed rotation. This is not anybody's final, this is the best rotation. This is just a work in progress rotation that Binkenstein made. And then my default rotation is a work in progress rotation that I made. All right, so that's how a little bit on how you take a SimC rotation and put it into AskMrRobot. So now let's run these and we'll compare them and see if we can figure out, if one is doing more damage than the other, we'll figure out why and try to improve the rotations.